Melania Trump hilariously destroys a liberal television host on live television. Her response leaves everyone speechless. Sarah Jones paced the length of her office, her heels clicking against the polished floor with military precision. The Manhattan skyline stretched beyond her window, but she barely noticed it anymore. After 15 years in television, the view had become just another backdrop. What mattered was what was happening inside the studio today. "Run it by me again," she barked into her phone. "Every detail, Jake. I don't want any surprises." Her executive producer sighed on the other end. "Sarah, we've been over this 10 times. Then, make it 11. "Fine." Jake shuffled some papers. Melania Trump arrives at 7:15 a.m. Security sweeps already done. Her team requested minimal makeup time. They're bringing their own person. "Of course they are," Sarah snorted. "Heaven forbid we make her look bad. We've got her for 45 minutes total. First segment is 15 minutes, then the break, then 30 minutes for the main event." Sarah stopped at her desk, picking up a thick folder labeled MT Research. "And you're sure about these sources?" "Triple. Checked everything. The financial records, the overseas connections, the foundation's tax documents. It's all solid." "Look, Sarah, you've done this 100 times. Why are you so wound up about this one?" She sank into her chair, running a hand through her expertly styled brown hair. "Because this isn't just another interview, Jake. This is the one. You know what our ratings looked like last quarter. They weren't that bad. They were garbage, and you know it." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Anderson's show is eating our lunch. Matthews is crushing the morning slot. We need this." There was a long pause on the line. "Sarah, just don't go too hard too fast. Build up to it. I know how to do my job, Jake." "Yeah, you do. That's why you're the best." "But Melania's not some city council member or D-list celebrity. She's got resources, connections." "And a lot to hide," Sarah cut him off. "Trust me, by the time I'm done, everyone's going to see exactly who she really is." The line went dead, and Sarah leaned back, staring at the ceiling. At 43, she was still at the top of her game, or at least that's what she told herself every morning in the mirror. The streak of gray she'd noticed last week was now safely covered up. The wrinkles around her eyes were expertly concealed. But in this business, you were only as good as your last big interview. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Melissa, her youngest producer, stuck her head in. Fresh out of Columbia Journalism School, she still had that eager puppy look that Sarah both envied and pitied. "Morning rundown's ready," Melissa said, clutching her tablet. "And you should see what's trending on Twitter about the interview." Sarah waved her in. "Give me the highlights." "It's crazy out there. Both sides are going nuts. Look at these numbers. We're already trending in 6 markets, and she hasn't even arrived. What's the hashtag game looking like?" Melissa scrolled through her tablet. Number Melania Speaks is the big one. Then there's number Real Talk Showdown. Number Trump vs. Jones. Oh, and your fan club's got number Queen Sarah trending again. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Any counter-programming we should worry about?" Matthews tried booking Eric Trump for the same time slot, but he fell through. "We've got the morning locked down." "Perfect." Sarah stood up, smoothing her crimson blazer. "What's the guest green room looking like?" "Everything's set to your specifications. Temperature at 72 degrees. Fresh flowers, but nothing too fragrant. Fiji water." "No, the other green room." Melissa's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, yeah, that's ready too. We've got the backup guests prepped if things go, you know." "If things go exactly as planned," Sarah corrected her. "Now, where's my research team?" The next hour was a blur of meetings, makeup touches, and last-minute prep. Sarah's dressing room became a war room, with producers, fact-checkers, and segment directors cycling through with updates and confirmations. "We've got eyes on her car," someone called out. 10 minutes out, Sarah stood before her full-length mirror, making minute adjustments to her outfit. The crimson blazer was a power move. Studies showed red created confrontational energy on camera. Her skirt was designer but not flashy, professional but approachable. The whole look said, "Trust me, I'm just like you, but better." 5 minutes. Her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter. "Good luck, Mom. Love you." Sarah felt a twinge of guilt. When was the last time they'd had dinner together? But there'd be time for that after. After she'd secured her position, after she'd shown everyone she was still the queen of morning television. Mrs. Trump's in the building. The energy in the studio shifted instantly. Sarah could feel it even from her dressing room, that electric tension that preceded every big interview. But this was different. This was bigger. She made her way to the studio floor, nodding to crew members as she passed. They'd stripped down the usual morning show setup, replacing it with 2 chairs angled slightly toward each other. Intimate but confrontational. The lighting was perfect, soft enough to seem welcoming, but positioned to catch every micro-expression. 2 minutes to pre-interview check. Jake appeared at her side, coffee in hand. Security says she's got minimal staff with her, just makeup, 1 assistant, and Secret Service. Curious. Sarah accepted the coffee but didn't drink it. No lawyers? Not that we can see. She's either very confident or very stupid. Jake gave her a warning look. Sarah. I know. Build up to it. The floor director approached, headset firmly in place. Ready for pre-interview greet? Sarah nodded, handing her coffee back to Jake. This was always the dance, the fake warmth, the pretend camaraderie before the real show began. She'd done it with senators, celebrities, whistleblowers. Each one thinking they were prepared, each one wrong. The green room door opened. Sarah's first thought was that Melania Trump was shorter in person than she'd expected. The former First Lady stepped onto the studio floor wearing a simple blue dress that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly mortgage payment. Her makeup was flawless, her posture perfect. But there was something else, something in her eyes, that Sarah hadn't expected to see. Confidence. Mrs. Trump. Sarah extended her hand, smile firmly in place. Thank you so much for joining us. Melania's handshake was firm but brief. Thank you for having me. Her accent was there, but less pronounced than in older clips Sarah had studied. I hope the trip in wasn't too tedious, Sarah continued, maintaining eye contact, looking for weakness. Traffic can be terrible this time of morning. It was fine. Melania glanced around the studio, taking in the setup. You have changed your usual layout. It wasn't a question. Sarah's smile tightened slightly. We wanted to create a more intimate setting for our conversation. I see. Melania's expression gave away nothing. A makeup artist hurried over, brush at the ready. Final touches? No thank you, Melania said firmly. I am ready. Sarah watched as the former First Lady took her seat, arranging herself with practiced grace. No papers, no notes. Just a small clutch purse that had already been checked by security. 60 seconds to air. Jake's voice crackled in Sarah's earpiece. Remember the plan. Easy questions first. Build rapport. Sarah took her own seat, angling herself forward slightly. Aggressive, but not obvious about it. 30 seconds. Melania sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap. No nervous adjustments. No last-minute fidgeting. 10 seconds. Sarah felt her game face slide into place. The smile that had launched 1,000 exposés. The look that had made corrupt politicians sweat and celebrities crack. 5, 4. The floor director's fingers continued the silent count. 3, 2, 1. The red light blinked on. Good morning, and welcome to Real Talk Morning Show. I'm Sarah Jones, and today, we have a very special guest. The trap was set, and Sarah Jones was ready for blood. But in the back of her mind, a tiny voice whispered a warning. Something about this felt different. Something about the calm way Melania Trump watched her. The slight curve of her lip that wasn't quite a smile. Sarah pushed the thought away. She had her plan. She had her research. She had her trap. What she didn't know was that she was walking into one of her own. Mrs. Trump, Sarah began with a practiced smile. Let's talk about why you're really here today. Melania tilted her head slightly, that same enigmatic expression still in place. I believe my team was clear about the purpose of this interview. We're here to discuss the new education initiative. Of course, Sarah nodded, her voice honey-sweet. But our viewers want to know the real Melania Trump, the woman behind the headlines. She leaned forward slightly. Let's start with something simple. Your recent appearances have been limited. Some might say strategic. Why choose our show for your return to the spotlight? The camera caught Melania's slight shoulder adjustment, a movement so subtle most viewers would miss it. But Sarah didn't miss anything. She'd made her career catching these tiny tells. Your show reaches many mothers, Melania replied evenly. Working mothers, single mothers, mothers who care about their children's education. These are the people I want to reach. Sarah's smile widened fractionally. First blood. Interesting you should mention working mothers. Our research team. Sarah. Jake's voice crackled urgently in her earpiece. Pace yourself. Remember the setup. Our research team tells me you've been doing remarkable work with children's literacy. Sarah course-corrected smoothly. Tell us about that. A producer off-camera gave her a thumbs up. Good recovery. Build the trust before the strike. Literacy is fundamental, Melania began, her voice taking on a passionate edge that seemed to surprise even Sarah. Did you know that in some districts, only 30% of third graders read at grade level? This is America. We can do better. Absolutely, Sarah nodded, shuffling her papers performatively. And your foundation has been active in this area? There it was. The first subtle jab. The slight emphasis on active that suggested something else entirely. But Melania didn't bite. Very active. Would you like to see our latest results? Oh, we'll get to those. Sarah waved her hand dismissively. But first, let's talk about your journey. From Slovenia to the White House to here. Our viewers love a good immigrant success story. The slight narrowing of Melania's eyes was exactly what Sarah had been waiting for. The former First Lady sat straighter, if that was even possible. You know, Sarah, Melania's accent seemed to thicken slightly. Many people focus on where I came from. Perhaps we should focus on where our children are going. The studio lights suddenly felt warmer. Sarah tugged slightly at her collar. Speaking of children, she pressed on, your own educational background has been a subject of, let's say, interesting discussion. 5 minutes to break, Jake's voice warned in her ear. Don't blow the big reveal too soon. Melania reached for her clutch, and Sarah felt a surge of triumph. Finally, a nervous gesture. But when the former First Lady's hand emerged, it held only a small notebook. Since you bring up education, Melania said calmly, I have some figures I'd like to share with your viewers. We have our own research, Sarah interjected quickly. Too quickly? No, stay in control. But before we get into statistics, let's talk about 350,000. Melania cut in, her voice carrying an authority that made Sarah blink. That's how many children in this country missed more than 3 weeks of school last year. Shall we discuss why? This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Sarah felt her carefully crafted timeline slipping. She glanced at her notes, then at the camera. The red light blinked steadily, indifferent to her growing discomfort. Mrs. Trump, she tried again, our viewers. Your viewers are parents, Melania continued, flipping her notebook open. Parents who worry about their children's future. Parents who don't care about politics or ratings or… She paused, meeting Sarah's gaze directly, or traps. The word hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt a bead of sweat threaten to break through her perfectly applied makeup. 2 minutes to break, Jake reminded her. Keep it together. Sarah Jones hadn't become the queen of morning television by losing control. She'd interviewed presidents, brought down corporations, made billionaires squirm. This was just another interview. Just another target. Speaking of traps, she smiled, reaching for her own folder. Let's discuss some interesting financial records we've uncovered. 30 seconds. But Melania was already speaking, her voice carrying a quiet power that seemed to fill the studio. You know what I think, Sarah? I think your viewers deserve better than what you're about to do. I'm sorry? Sarah's hand froze halfway to her folder. 10 seconds to break. Melania leaned forward, matching Sarah's earlier aggressive posture. So why don't we give them what they deserve? The truth. And we're out. Back in 3 minutes. Sarah sat back, heart pounding. What had just happened? She'd barely landed a single hit, and somehow she felt like she'd been the one taking punches. Jake was already hurrying toward her, coffee and makeup team in tow. But Sarah's eyes remained locked on Melania, who sat calmly flipping through her little notebook as if she had all the time in the world. The trap was still there. Still waiting. All the research. All the revelations. All the career-making moments Sarah had planned. But for the first time in 15 years of interviews, Sarah Jones felt something she'd never expected to feel. Fear. The break wouldn't last forever. In 3 minutes, they'd be back on air. In 3 minutes, Sarah would have to either stick to her plan or adapt. In 3 minutes. She looked down at her folder of ammunition, then back at Melania, who was now watching her with what almost looked like pity. 3 minutes had never felt so short. The 3-minute commercial break felt like an eternity, and a split second, all at once. Sarah's team swarmed around her like angry bees, powdering her increasingly shiny forehead, adjusting her microphone, shoving new talking points into her hands. "You need to hit harder," Jake hissed in her ear while the makeup artist dabbed at her face. "She's controlling the pace." "You think I don't know that?" Sarah snapped, swatting away a powder puff. "Something's off. She's too prepared." Across the studio, Melania sat perfectly still, declining the offered touch-ups. Her assistant stood nearby, phone in hand, but the former First Lady hadn't so much as glanced at her during the break. 60 seconds, the floor director called out. Jake crouched beside Sarah's chair, his voice low and urgent. "Look, forget the build-up. Go straight for the foundation records. We've got her on the numbers." 45 seconds. Sarah flipped through her folder frantically. The papers suddenly seemed to blur together, the carefully highlighted sections bleeding into one another. 30 seconds. "Mrs. Trump?" A young production assistant approached Melania timidly. "Can I get you some water?" Melania smiled, actually smiled, at the girl. "No, thank you, dear. But you have something." She reached out and gently fixed the assistant's crooked nameplate. The girl blushed and scurried away. 10 seconds. Sarah's jaw clenched. Even the damn production assistants were falling under her spell. 5, 4. The familiar countdown continued silently. Sarah straightened her spine, plastered on her signature smile, and turned to face the camera. Welcome back to Real Talk Morning Show. If you're just joining us, we're here with former First Lady Melania Trump discussing her new education initiative. Sarah's voice dripped with manufactured warmth. "Mrs. Trump, before the break, you mentioned some statistics about school attendance." "Yes," Melania began, but Sarah wasn't finished. "But what our viewers might find more interesting are some other numbers." She pulled out a sheet from her folder with flourish. "Specifically about your foundation's spending patterns." A subtle shift rippled through the studio. Camera operators exchanged glances. This wasn't in the scheduled rundown. "The numbers," Melania said calmly, "are all public record." "Oh, they certainly are." Sarah's smile turned predatory, including some fascinating transfers to offshore accounts in. "Number." The word wasn't loud, wasn't angry, but it cut through the studio like a knife. Sarah blinked. "I'm sorry?" "No," Melania repeated, her accent stronger now but her voice steady. "For years, I've watched people like you try to tear me down. You think because I'm an immigrant, because I was a model, because I'm Trump's wife, I'm stupid?" The studio went dead silent. Even the ever-present hum of equipment seemed to fade away. Sarah's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. This wasn't in her script. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. "Mrs. Trump, I assure you." "You assure me nothing." Melania's eyes blazed with an intensity that made the camera zoom in involuntarily. "You invited me here to talk about education. About children. Instead, you play games with papers and innuendos." In the control room, producers scrambled. "Should we cut?" someone whispered. "Don't you dare," Jake breathed, watching the monitors with wide eyes. "This is gold." Sarah tried to regain control. "These documents clearly show..." "Show what?" Melania reached into her clutch and pulled out a thin file of her own. "That my foundation spent money helping schools in poor neighborhoods? That we funded literacy programs in areas your network never even visits?" The papers in Sarah's hands suddenly felt very light, very flimsy. "But the offshore accounts are matching funds from international partners." Melania's voice never raised, but it filled the studio nonetheless. "Every dollar tracked, every penny accounted for. Would you like to see the audits? I brought those too. In her earpiece, Sarah heard chaos. Producers arguing, fact-checkers scrambling, Jake swearing softly. We have sources, Sarah started. Names, Melania cut in. Give me names. Show me proof. Not rumors, not sources say. Real proof. The silence that followed was deafening. You can't, can you? Melania shook her head slowly. Because there isn't any. But you didn't care about that. You didn't care about the children we help, the families we support. You wanted. She gestured at the cameras, the lights, the whole studio setup. This. A show. Sarah felt sweat trickling down her back. Her crimson blazer, chosen to display power, suddenly felt suffocating. Our research team did not do their job. Melania opened her file. Let me help them. Page 1. Complete financial records, certified by 3 independent auditors. Page 2. Impact reports from every school district we work with. Page 3. Each page she turned felt like another nail in Sarah's coffin. The former First Lady's perfectly manicured fingers moved through the documents with practiced ease, laying out fact after fact, figure after figure. In the control room, Jake watched in horror as his star host withered under the onslaught of pure, unassailable data. Get her out of this, he barked at his team. Find something, anything. But Melania wasn't finished. She looked directly into camera 1, her gaze seeming to pierce through screens across America. You know what the real story is, Sarah. While you were digging for scandals, we were building schools. While you were crafting gotcha questions, we were training teachers. While you were planning this ambush, we were helping children learn to read. The studio felt impossibly hot now. Sarah tugged at her collar, her practiced poise crumbling. We should take another break. No more breaks. Melania's tone was final. Your viewers deserve the truth. Not headlines. Not drama. Truth. She turned to another camera, her expression softening. To every parent watching, your children's education is not a game, not a ratings grab, not a political football. It's their future. And that's what I came here to discuss. Sarah watched helplessly as Melania began laying out her initiative. Clear, concise points. Practical solutions. Real problems and real answers. No flash, no drama, just substance. In her earpiece, Jake had gone quiet. The producers had stopped shouting suggestions. Even the camera operators seemed transfixed. Mrs. Trump? Sarah tried one last time, her voice weak. About those offshore transactions. Melania paused, fixing Sarah with a look that mixed pity with something else. Disappointment, maybe. You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about transactions, or scandals, or ratings. This is about children. Their future, their dreams. She leaned forward. But perhaps that's too, what's the word? Boring? Not dramatic enough for real talk? The air quotes were subtle but devastating. In the control room, Jake collapsed into a chair. She played us, he whispered. My God, she played us like a fiddle. Sarah felt her carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. 15 years of ambushes, gotcha moments, and career-making takedowns, and she'd never seen anything like this. The former First Lady wasn't just defending herself. She wasn't just turning the tables. She was rewriting the whole damn script. Now, Melania continued, her voice taking on a teacher's patience. Shall we talk about what really matters? Or would you prefer to continue with your... She glanced at Sarah's folder of evidence with something approaching amusement. Research? The question hung in the air like a sword. Sarah looked at her notes, her precious ammunition now feeling as substantial as tissue paper. She looked at the cameras, their unblinking eyes capturing every excruciating moment. She looked at her team, their faces a mix of shock and something that looked dangerously like respect for the wrong person. Finally, she looked at Melania Trump, who waited patiently for her answer. The former First Lady's expression hadn't changed, but there was something in her eyes now. Not triumph, not anger. Just expectation. As if she was giving Sarah one last chance to do the right thing. The studio lights still blazed. The cameras still rolled. America still watched. But in that moment, Sarah Jones, the queen of gotcha journalism, the slayer of political careers, the terror of morning television, faced a choice that would define the rest of her career. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, she'd been the fool all along. "We're running long," Jake's voice crackled in her earpiece, sounding defeated. "Need a decision. Now." Sarah took a deep breath, straightened her blazer, and made her choice. But as she opened her mouth to speak, she realized with crystal clarity that Melania Trump had already won. Not with scandal or drama or clever tricks, but with something far more powerful: the simple, unvarnished truth. Sarah cleared her throat. "You're right, Mrs. Trump. Let's talk about the children." The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but something else was happening, something unexpected. As soon as she said it, a weight seemed to lift from her shoulders. Finally, Melania nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Shall we begin with the pilot program in Detroit?" In the control room, Jake slumped forward, head in his hands. "There goes our sweeps week." But on the studio floor, something remarkable was taking shape. As Melania began outlining her initiative, Sarah found herself actually listening, really listening. Not for angles or gotcha moments, but to the substance. "Last year," Melania explained, pulling out a series of photographs, "I visited PS 127 in Detroit. Do you know what I found? Brilliant children, dedicated teachers. But no books published after 2005. No computers that could run modern educational software." She laid the photos out one by one. Children crowded around a single outdated computer, empty library shelves, a classroom with peeling paint and broken windows. "This," she continued, her accent thickening with emotion, "is the real scandal you should be investigating." Sarah leaned forward, her journalist's instincts kicking in for a different reason now. "And your foundation?" "We started small. One school, new books, updated technology, teacher training programs." Melania's eyes lit up with genuine passion. Within 6 months, reading scores improved 40%. In her earpiece, Sarah heard surprised murmurs from the fact-checking team. "She's right," someone confirmed. "The numbers match." "But that wasn't enough," Melania continued. "Because PS 127 is not alone. There are schools like this across America, while politicians argue and television hosts." She gave Sarah a pointed look. "Chase ratings. Children fall behind." The studio lights didn't feel so hot anymore. The camera's gaze didn't feel so predatory. Something was shifting in the air. "Mrs. Trump," Sarah heard herself saying, "tell us more about the reading scores." Jake's voice crackled in her ear. "What are you doing? This isn't the plan." But Sarah reached up and, with deliberate slowness, removed her earpiece. The simple action sent shockwaves through the studio. In 15 years, she'd never gone off-grid during a live interview. Melania noticed the gesture. A slight smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Perhaps," she said softly, "this is why they call it real talk." For the next 20 minutes, the interview transformed into something nobody had expected, least of all Sarah Jones. Gone were the ambush questions, the gotcha moments, the carefully planned traps. Instead, 2 women discussed something that actually mattered. Melania shared stories from her school visits, not photo ops, but real, unscripted encounters with students and teachers. She talked about a 3rd grader named Marcus who had never owned a book of his own until her foundations program. About Mrs. Rodriguez, a teacher who spent her own money on supplies until the foundation stepped in. "These are the stories America needs to hear," Melania said firmly. "Not gossip, not scandals, this." The studio audience, usually coached for reactions, sat in genuine rapt attention. Even the usually restless camera operators stood transfixed. Sarah found herself taking actual notes, not for ammunition, but because she was genuinely interested. "What about funding?" she asked, her reporter's mind engaging in a new way. "These programs can't be cheap." "Ah," Melania smiled. "Now you ask the right question." She pulled out another document. "This is where those suspicious international transfers come in. We've partnered with education foundations in Finland, Singapore, Germany, countries with proven success in public education." She laid out a complex but transparent network of funding streams, matching grants and public-private partnerships. Everything documented, Everything above board. Everything focused on one goal: helping kids learn. You see, Sarah, Melania's voice took on an almost gentle tone. Sometimes the real story is not where you think it is. Sometimes it's not about scandal or drama, or she gestured at the abandoned folder of evidence on Sarah's desk. Whatever is in there. Sarah felt her face flush. Those documents are probably very impressive, Melania finished for her. But let me ask you something. When was the last time you visited a public school? Not for a story, not for ratings, just to see? The question hit like a physical blow. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. She couldn't remember. I thought so. Melania turned back to the cameras. This is my challenge to everyone watching. Visit your local school, talk to teachers, ask what they need. Stop waiting for politicians or celebrities or... She glanced at Sarah, with what might have been a hint of growing respect. Journalists to fix things. In the control room, Jake had given up trying to salvage the original plan. Instead, he sat mesmerized like everyone else. Are you seeing these numbers? He whispered to no one in particular, staring at the live viewing data. They're actually going up. Sarah felt something stirring in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. The reason she'd become a journalist in the first place. The desire to uncover truth, real truth, not manufactured drama. Mrs. Trump, she said, her voice different now, more genuine. What can we do, not as a show, but as people? Melania's expression changed then, really changed, for the first time since she'd walked into the studio. The careful poise melted into something warmer, more real. That, she said softly, is the best question you've asked all day. The studio lights still blazed, the cameras still rolled, but something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't an ambush anymore. It wasn't even an interview. It was becoming something far more powerful. A moment of genuine truth on American television. And in that moment, Sarah Jones, who had built her career on taking people down, found herself being lifted up instead. Not by scandal or sensationalism, but by something she'd forgotten existed in her world. Authenticity. The next segment would change everything. For her, for the show, for morning television itself. But right now, in this unexpected moment of clarity, none of that seemed to matter. What mattered was that somewhere in Detroit, kids at PS 127 were learning to read. Real stories were waiting to be told. And maybe, just maybe, Sarah Jones was remembering how to tell them. The studio lights seemed different now, less harsh, more illuminating. As the show returned from its second commercial break, the energy had shifted palpably. But Sarah Jones wasn't done yet. Old habits die hard, and 15 years of attack dog journalism don't fade in a single segment. Welcome back to Real Talk, Sarah began, her voice carrying a hint of its former edge. Mrs. Trump, before the break, we were discussing your education initiative, but I think our viewers would like to know. About the mothers? Melania cut in smoothly. Yes, let's talk about them. Sarah blinked. That wasn't the direction she'd planned to go. I was actually going to ask about, what about the thousands of kids who can't read? Melania's voice carried a new intensity. What about the mothers working 2 jobs while their children struggle? The control room erupted in confused chatter. Jake's voice crackled in Sarah's newly replaced earpiece. Where is she going with this? Get control back. But Melania was already standing up, something no guest had ever done mid-interview on Real Talk. The camera operators instinctively followed her movement, even as the floor director frantically signaled for them to stay on Sarah. You want to talk about my clothes? Melania gestured to her outfit. Fine. This dress, $100 from Macy's. Now let's talk about real things. Sarah's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The folder of evidence on her lap suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Mrs. Trump, please, if you could just sit. Number. Melania's accent grew stronger with emotion, but her words remained crystal clear. Do you know what a mother in Detroit told me last week? She works 3 jobs, 3, to keep her children in a decent school district. She leaves at 5 a.m. and returns at 10 p.m. Her daughter helps her younger siblings with homework because she's not there to do it. In the control room, Jake reached for the kill switch, the button that would cut to commercial. But something stopped him. The viewing numbers on his screen were skyrocketing. This isn't protocol. Sarah tried again, her professional mask slipping. We have a format. Format? Melania turned to face her directly. Like your format for ambushing guests? Your format for caring more about scandals than solutions? The studio audience, usually carefully coached on when to react, broke into spontaneous applause. A producer frantically waved for them to stop, but it was too late. Listen, Sarah felt sweat beading on her forehead. Our research indicates certain irregularities in your foundations. Research? Melania shook her head. Let me tell you about research. I spent 6 months visiting schools across this country. Not for photo ops, not for publicity. I sat with teachers who spend their own money on basic supplies. I met children who share single textbooks between 4 students. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn notebook. You want numbers? I have numbers. PS 127 in Detroit, average reading score, 32% below national standard. Why? No funding for reading specialists. Washington Heights Elementary, math scores dropping for 3 years straight. Why? Can't afford to replace broken calculators. Sarah glanced desperately at her producers. But they were all watching Melania with the same mesmerized expression as everyone else. Mrs. Trump, she tried one last time, about your clothes. You really want to talk about my clothes? Melania's eyes flashed. Okay, let's talk. This dress, yes, Macy's, $100. You know why? Because every time I visit a school, mothers ask me where I got my outfit. They want to look professional for their jobs, for parent-teacher conferences, but they can't afford designer labels. She took a step closer to Sarah's chair. So today, I wore this dress to show them. You don't need expensive clothes to have dignity. You don't need a fancy label to make a difference. The studio was dead silent now. Even the usual mechanical hum seemed muted. But you, Melania continued, her voice carrying a mix of disappointment and challenge. You wanted a different story. You wanted to talk about offshore accounts? About my accent? About whether I'm qualified to care about education? Sarah felt her face burning. Those exact questions were in her folder, planned for the show's final segment. We have a responsibility to our viewers. Yes, Melania's voice rose slightly. Finally, you say something true. Responsibility. But what is that responsibility? To chase ratings? Or to help people? She turned to address the camera directly, her presence commanding the lens. You want to know why I really came on this show? Because despite everything, despite the planned ambush, despite the hidden agenda, you have reach. You have viewers. Mothers watch this show while getting their children ready for school. Teachers watch during their lunch breaks. In the control room, Jake sat back, a look of dawning realization on his face. She's not defending herself, he whispered. She's using us. Sarah watched as Melania pulled out more photos, not glossy PR shots, but real, sometimes blurry pictures taken on school visits. Children crowded around outdated computers, empty library shelves, a teacher's receipt for supplies bought with her own money. You want a story? Melania's voice softened. Here are your stories. Real stories. Not about me, not about politics, but about our children. Their future. The teleprompter had long since gone dark. The carefully planned segments lay abandoned. Even Sarah's folder of evidence had slipped to the floor, unnoticed. But, Sarah found herself saying, her journalist's instincts fighting one last battle. Our sources. Your sources? Melania reached into her bag again. Here are my sources. Letters from teachers. Thank you notes from students. Real people, real names, real stories. She began reading from one letter, her accent adding weight to each word. Dear Mrs. Trump, before your foundation helped our school, I had to choose between buying lunch or printing worksheets for my students. Now, Sarah's face had turned red, but not from anger anymore. Something else was creeping in. Something that felt dangerously like shame. The thing is, Melania continued, her voice gaining strength, while shows like yours chase scandals, real problems go unnoticed, real stories go untold. You want to talk about my accent? Talk about why ESL programs are underfunded. You want to discuss my clothes? Let's discuss why teachers have to buy their own classroom supplies. The studio audience had begun nodding, some wiping tears. Even the most jaded crew members stood transfixed. But here's what really matters, Melania said, her voice dropping to an intense near whisper that somehow carried more power than any shout. While we sit here, playing games with gotcha questions and hidden agendas, children are falling behind. Mothers are working themselves to exhaustion. Teachers are spending their own money to do their jobs. She turned back to Sarah, but her words were clearly meant for everyone watching. So yes, let's talk about real things. Let's talk about solutions. Let's talk about what matters. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah Jones, the queen of gotcha journalism, sat speechless in her carefully chosen power blazer, while Melania Trump, in her $100 Macy's dress, commanded the studio with nothing but truth. And then, something extraordinary happened. Something that would be talked about in journalism schools for years to come. Sarah Jones, live on national television, did something she'd never done before. She listened. And as she listened, something remarkable began to unfold on live television. "Tell me about Marcus," Sarah said quietly, her voice stripped of its usual performative polish. "The boy from PS 127. Melania's expression softened slightly. "You want to know about Marcus?" "Yes." Sarah glanced at her fallen folder of evidence and deliberately pushed it aside with her foot. "Tell us about him. Tell us everything." In the control room, Jake leaned forward, finger hovering over the commercial break button, but he couldn't bring himself to press it. The raw authenticity unfolding on his monitors was something he hadn't seen in 20 years of television production. "Marcus," Melania began, settling back into her chair, "is 11 years old. When I first met him, he was hiding in the school library during lunch break. Do you know why?" Sarah shook her head. "Because he was ashamed. At 11 years old, he could barely read at a second-grade level. Not because he isn't bright, he's brilliant with numbers, actually. But because the school's reading specialist position was cut 3 years ago due to budget constraints." She pulled out her phone and showed a photo, not a staged PR shot, but a slightly blurry candid of a young boy hunched over a book. "This was Marcus 6 months ago. And this," she swiped to another photo, "is him last week." The second photo showed the same boy, but transformed, standing proud, holding up a book report with an A marked in red at the top. "What changed?" Sarah found herself asking, genuinely curious. "We didn't just give books. We brought in specialized teachers, implemented proven reading programs. But most importantly," Melania's voice filled with emotion, "we gave him dignity, the chance to learn without shame." In the studio audience, someone sniffled. A production assistant quietly passed out tissues. "And the mothers?" Sarah pressed, her reporter's instincts now working in a different direction. "You mentioned mothers working multiple jobs." "Like Maria Rodriguez." Melania nodded. "Single mother of 3. Works as a nurse during the day, clerk at night. Her daughter Angela, 12 years old, acts as a parent when Maria's at work. Makes dinner, helps with homework, grows up too fast." She stood again. But this time, it wasn't confrontational. It was passionate. "You want to talk about fashion?" Her voice carried a mix of frustration and determination. "Maria wears the same 2 scrubs every week because she spends her clothing budget on her children's school supplies. You want to discuss my accent?" Maria's accent keeps her from advancing at work, despite 12 years of nursing experience. The studio lights caught the glint of moisture in Melania's eyes, but her voice remained steady. "These are the real stories, Sarah. Not political drama. Not celebrity gossip. Real people. Real struggles." Sarah felt something shift inside her, a wall crumbling, a perspective changing. "How?" She cleared her throat, emotion threatening to break through. "How can we help?" Jake's voice crackled in her earpiece. "Sarah, what are you doing?" She reached up and removed the earpiece again, this time dropping it deliberately on the floor. "Tell us, Mrs. Trump. Not as a show looking for ratings. As people who want to make a difference. What can we do?" Melania's expression changed, really changed. For the first time since entering the studio. The careful poise melted into something more real. More urgent. "You want to know what you can do?" She addressed not just Sarah now, but the cameras, the audience, everyone watching at home. "Stop waiting for politicians to fix everything. Stop focusing on scandals and start focusing on solutions. She began laying out specific actions, ways to support local schools, volunteer programs, resource-sharing initiatives. Not vague platitudes, but concrete steps anyone could take. And you, she turned back to Sarah. You have a platform. Use it. Not for gotcha moments, not for takedowns. Use it to tell stories that matter. The studio audience broke into spontaneous applause again, but this time, no one tried to stop them. Sarah felt tears threatening to spill, real tears, not the camera-ready kind she'd perfected over years of emotional interviews. Her carefully constructed persona was cracking, revealing something she'd thought long buried, a genuine journalist who cared about truth. "Mrs. Trump," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I think we need to apologize to our viewers." "No," Melania replied gently. "What we need to do is show them something better, starting now." And for the next 20 minutes, that's exactly what happened. Two women, dropping all pretense, had a real conversation about real issues. No ambush questions, no hidden agendas, just truth. In the control room, Jake watched in amazement as the viewing numbers kept climbing. Social media was exploding. Real talk was trending, but not for the reasons they'd planned. This wasn't the takedown they'd prepared for. It was something far more powerful. It was the truth. The studio hummed with an energy unlike anything its walls had contained in years. The carefully orchestrated chaos of morning television had given way to something raw and real. In the control room, producers sat stunned, watching history unfold on their monitors. On the floor, camera operators moved with uncanny intuition, capturing every nuance of this unexpected moment. Sarah Jones sat in her host's chair, her crimson blazer now feeling more like armor than power suit. The folder of evidence lay forgotten on the floor, its contents scattered like fallen leaves. And Melania Trump, in her $100 Macy's dress, stood ready to deliver the final act of this unprecedented morning. "Before we end," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new humility, "I think our viewers deserve—" "Yes," Melania nodded, "they do deserve something. But not what you think." She stood, and this time, no one even thought to stop her. The camera followed her movement as if magnetized. "To every person watching who's been judged," she began, her accent strong but her words stronger, "who's been mocked, who's been told they're not enough, you are enough." The studio audience leaned forward in their seats, tissues clutched in hands, phones forgotten in laps. "Your accent doesn't define you." Melania's eyes blazed with intensity. "Your past doesn't define you. What defines you is what you do today." In the control room, Jake had long since abandoned any pretense of directing the show. "Are you getting this?" he whispered to no one in particular. "Tell me we're getting this." "Mrs. Trump," Sarah attempted to regain some semblance of her host role. "What you're saying is what should have been said long ago." Melania turned to face her directly. "You know, Sarah, for weeks your team has been digging, looking for scandals, for gotcha moments, for ways to tear someone down." She paused, letting the words sink in. "But what did you find? A foundation that helps children learn to read, a program that supports working mothers, initiatives that make real differences in real lives." The silence in the studio was absolute. Even the usual shuffling and coughing had ceased. "You wanted drama?" Melania's voice carried a hint of irony. "Here's your drama. Every day in this country, children go to schools without proper books. Every day, mothers choose between buying food and buying school supplies. Every day, teachers spend their own money to do their jobs." She reached into her bag one last time, pulling out a simple notebook. "This," she held it up, "belongs to Marcus, the boy we discussed earlier. Inside are his reading progress notes, his dreams, his future." She opened it carefully. "Would you like to know what he wrote last week?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "Dear Mrs. Trump," Melania read, her accent giving the words a musical quality. "Today I finished my first chapter book by myself. My mom cried. I didn't tell her, but I cried too. Thank you for believing in me." In the audience, several people were openly weeping now. A cameraman wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "This," Melania held up the notebook, "is the real story. Not my clothes, not my accent, not whatever is in that folder on your floor." She turned to address the main camera. and it was as if she was speaking to every viewer individually. You want to know the truth about Melania Trump? Here it is. I am an immigrant who learned English as my fourth language. I was a model who now builds schools. I am a mother who believes every child deserves a chance. Her voice grew stronger with each word. But, more importantly, I am just one person trying to make a difference. Like Maria working 3 jobs for her children's education. Like Mrs. Johnson spending her own money on classroom supplies. Like Marcus, brave enough to keep trying when reading feels impossible. She took a step closer to the camera. These are the stories that matter. These are the people who deserve our attention. Not celebrities, not scandals, not ratings. Sarah watched, transfixed, as Melania turned back to her. There was no anger in her expression now. No judgment. Just a quiet challenge. So, Sarah Jones, Melania's voice softened. What kind of stories will you tell tomorrow? The question hung in the air like a bell tone. Sarah felt the weight of 15 years of ambush journalism, gotcha moments, and manufactured drama pressing down on her shoulders. And suddenly, it all felt so small. She began, then stopped, started again. Take your time, Melania said gently. Real answers don't come in sound bites. A chuckle rippled through the studio, not mocking, but appreciative. Even Sarah managed a small smile. Maybe, she said finally, it's time for some new stories. Melania nodded, satisfaction flickering across her features. Now that, she said, would be real talk. She gathered her things, the notebook, the photos, the real evidence of real work, and prepared to leave. But before she did, she had one last thing to say. Thank you for having me, she addressed Sarah with unexpected warmth. But next time, maybe try less gossip, more truth. The words weren't delivered with venom or triumph. They were offered like advice from one professional to another, from one woman to another, from one human being to another. As Melania walked off the set, the studio erupted. People jumped to their feet. Applause thundered. Even some of the crew were clapping. Sarah Jones, the queen of gotcha moments, had just been got, not by clever traps or nasty comebacks, but by raw, simple truth. In the control room, Jake stared at his monitors in disbelief. Cut to commercial, he whispered. Then louder, cut to commercial. But no one moved. No one wanted to break this moment. Because something extraordinary had happened on live television that morning. Something real. Something true. The clip hit social media minutes later. No fancy words, no political games, just real talk from an unexpected source. And America couldn't stop watching. Hours later, as the studio emptied and the lights dimmed, Sarah Jones sat alone in her office. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Calls from network executives, messages from colleagues, reactions from viewers. But she wasn't looking at any of them. Instead, she was staring at a blank document on her computer screen. At the top, she'd typed 2 words. Real stories. And, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Sarah Jones, the journalist who'd built her career on tearing people down, felt ready to build something up instead. Sometimes, the biggest mic drops aren't about winning arguments or scoring points. Sometimes, they're about changing hearts, changing minds, changing direction. And on that morning, in a studio in New York City, everything changed. Because sometimes, the truth is the most powerful mic drop of all. The aftermath was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the clip had gone viral in ways nobody could have predicted. Number Real Talk and number Melania Speaks dominated social media, but not with the usual political division. Something different was happening. Teachers shared their own stories of buying supplies. Working mothers posted photos of their late-night homework sessions with their children. Even rival networks couldn't help but cover the moment. We're going with this as our lead, Jake announced, bursting into Sarah's office later that afternoon. Every network is running it, but we've got the whole thing. Sarah looked up from her computer, where she'd been typing continuously for the past hour. Number. What do you mean, no? This is huge. The ratings are. Sarah cut him off. We're not just running the clip, we're doing something more. She turned her screen around. Jake leaned in to read. Real Talk, A New Direction. By Sarah Jones. Today, I had planned an ambush. Instead, I got a wake-up call. Jake's eyes widened as he scanned the document. Sarah, it's the truth. She sat back in her chair. For once. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from the network executives. They wanted to know her plan for tomorrow's show. For the first time in 15 years, she knew exactly what to say. Get me Marcus's school on the line, she told Jake. And Maria Rodriguez. And every teacher we can find who's buying their own supplies. You want to do a follow-up piece? Sarah shook her head. I want to do real journalism, starting now. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened at Real Talk Morning Show. The ambush interviews stopped. The gotcha moments disappeared. Instead, they started telling real stories. They visited PS 127 in Detroit, where Marcus proudly showed them his new reading achievements. They spent a day with Maria Rodriguez, documenting the reality of a working mother's life. They interviewed teachers who had been silently funding their classrooms for years. The ratings? They didn't just survive, they soared. Because as it turned out, America was hungry for something real. 1 week after the interview, Sarah received an unexpected package. Inside was a single book, a copy of The Little Engine That Could, with a note. For your new beginning. Sometimes the hardest words to say are, I think I can. Melania. Sarah placed it on her desk, next to her new story ideas and the growing pile of letters from viewers, sharing their own experiences. The crimson blazer hung in her closet, replaced by something more comfortable, more real. Because, sometimes, the biggest changes don't come from dramatic confrontations or clever traps. Sometimes, they come from simple truths, spoken with conviction. From real stories, told with compassion. From moments of authenticity in a world desperate for something genuine. In the end, Sarah Jones didn't just lose an interview. She found her way back to why she'd become a journalist in the first place. And Melania Trump didn't just win a media battle. She sparked a conversation about what really matters. As for Real Talk, well, for the first time in its history, it finally lived up to its name.